In my experience, the value is the dentist has owned this asset, something that they've poured their blood, sweat, and tears into for anywhere from 10 to 35, 40 years. And in my experience, the actual process of selling a dental practice is an incredibly emotional process for them because they've spent more time with the staff and the patients. They've typically seen grandparents and parents and kids and grandkids. And they've got staff that they've spent more time with in that time frame than they have with their own family as well. So an analogy that I like to use is that I've got a daughter, and I've told her that she can get married anytime she wants to after I'm dead. But she's probably not going to listen to me, and she's going to make me walk her down the aisle. And I think that that's as close of an analogy as what I can give for when a doctor is getting ready to sell their practice. And I think that it's important as somebody going through a very emotional process to have somebody guide them through it. And this process has become very technical. And typically the doctor wants the right person for that practice. So if that's the case, working with a professional that can go out and gather the right types of people for them to be able to interview and bring in to make sure that they're getting the right person to carry on their legacy is very important. Then you go beyond that and you just have all the intricacies of what happens in this process, and how complicated those things can be. And to be able to protect that goodwill, having an intermediary can be a huge benefit as well, because a buyer a lot of times may get emotional about something, and if that conversation isn't had properly, it can burn some of that goodwill with the seller, and vice versa, where I don't get emotional about this and a buyer or seller may say something to me that's emotional, but it's not going to get translated to the other party in that emotional manner. So I think that, kind of summing that up, you've got just the process of finding the right person, handling all the intricacies of a very complicated business transaction, and then also looking out for and protecting the goodwill of the buyer and the seller as you're going through that process. It's interesting. I tell people I went back and got my MBA back in 2010, and I jokingly tell people I should have gotten a degree in counseling, because that's essentially what a large part of what I do is help manage the emotions of the process. So you have the emotion of the seller who spent their entire life involved in this practice with these patients, and then you've got a young doctor that has a whole bunch of clinical training and typically a few years of clinical experience, but most of them have no experience reading a profit and loss statement or understanding how to manage a team. So as you go through this process, as I uncover kinks in the process, or what I call a pinch point, when you start peeling that onion back, it's typically on the buy side, am I getting what I'm paying for, which is ultimately just the goodwill. It's the reputation of that seller. And on the sell side, a lot of times it's as simple as, can this young person handle this? Or what I like to say, don't drop the baby. So yes, it can be managed, but it's typically, in my experience, the best way to manage it is putting a good team around both parties, right? So making sure that seller and buyer both have their own attorneys that have done hundreds of these dental transactions and understand how they work, and having a good dental CPA that can help them on the financial side. So the young doctor that doesn't understand that or have the experience has somebody in their corner that can help guide them and walk them through that and get them comfortable in understanding it. And then with the seller, what are the tax implications? And making sure that they've got somebody that can guide them through how to properly set that up. And then I like both sides to have a financial planner. The buyer's going to need a good dental lender. But putting those teams around is what I've found to be about the best way to help control those emotions as they're going through it. And then when there is a pinch point, we talk about it. Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time in the Marine Corps, and in the Marine Corps, we had a saying called the 6 Ps of the Marine Corps, which were proper prior planning prevents poor performance. And I think as far as when is the earliest time or when should they start, when I went through business school, one of the first things they taught us is when you start a business, the same time you're starting a business, you're starting to think about how are you going to exit? What's the succession plan? So you're always thinking forward. Now that goal is probably going to move as you go through the process. However, if you constantly are looking at it and saying, okay, what is my business valued at? How am I growing my business, and how can I transition out? You will be prepared for when that comes. So I don't think there's a time that's too early to start thinking about it. Typically, we like to have conversations as early as 10 plus years prior. Now, if you're already 2 years out, or if you're 6 months out, we need to have that conversation. And again, the old saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago or today. So the earlier, the better. It's just going to give us a better time and a better footprint to be able to start planning and putting all of the things in place that are going to help the doctor have the best and most successful transition they can have. If so, there's assignment, or there's typically language in every lease called assignment language. So if somebody's going to come in and buy your practice, they're going to need, that buyer is going to have that lease assigned to them so they can own that business. The bank needs it in place. They need to have a place to practice. They can't buy it and move across the street. The bank's just not going to allow it. So as a doctor that owns a practice that's in a lease space, whether it's the first time they get to that lease, well, whether it's a renewal option, at any point where there's some type of an execution of that lease, they need to have a dental attorney review that lease and make sure that the assignment language is as friendly as possible. Because, and also, what is their responsibility after that assignment has been transacted on? So, for example, are they still going to have to be a guarantor post assignment? So the earlier they can start that and get that type of language in there and get as tenant-friendly business and legal language put into that lease, the better and easier it's going to be. The ones where the landlord just comes in and says, hey, go ahead and sign this. We've had our attorneys already look at this. Those are typically you don't need to have somebody look at it. Those are typically the ones that end up getting us in trouble as we get to that point. And unfortunately, from time to time, a landlord can end up making it very difficult, possibly killing the lease or possibly devaluing the practice. So it's a very, very important thing to have an attorney review that, or work with a professional, a dental real estate professional that can help them make sure that they've got good language in there. Yeah, so I think that there's a time and place for all of these things, right? I think there's a lot of misinformation about DSOs, and a lot of times when I talk to doctors, sellers, they think their only option is to sell to a DSO because they've heard the propaganda of, oh, they're buying everything up and this is the only option you have. Young doctors can't get money, or young doctors don't have that entrepreneurial spirit and they don't want to own. Well, our data shows the exact opposite of that. So our data shows that about 70% of the sellers we sell to are private individual doctors. I recently spoke with my Bank of America rep. They did over 800 million in transactions last year with dentists. 75% of those were first-time independent buyers. So there's a large buying group out there of private doctors. So the first thing is that, one, it's not the only option that they have. But for some sellers, the DSO option is the right. And I'll give an example. If you've got a $3.5 million practice, it's going to be really hard to find an individual that could come in and get financed and be able to take that over, especially then you say, well, the average buyer's 32 years old, taking over a business that big that doesn't really even have the skills. It's really, really difficult to do. And sometimes the best option is to find a good DSO to roll that practice up to, transition that practice to, that's going to protect the legacy of that practice. There's a lot of value in selling to an individual. And let me back up. Those DSO transactions are incredibly complicated. And you're dealing with people that are professional buyers. So going back to where's the value in a broker, having somebody that can help guide you through a DSO deal is imperative. We have seen millions of dollars left on the table because people went unrepresented in those types of transactions. A private buyer, I think the real value there is, and again, if I talk to 10 dentists, 9 of them are telling me I'd prefer to sell to a younger version of myself. In those scenarios, what typically they want is they want to protect that legacy that the doctors created. And The individual buyers are out there, that legacy can be protected. These banks are happy to give these young doctors money, even though they've got debt. And if you look at the statistics of what a practice owner makes versus what an associate makes, they're in a better position to own a practice from a financial standpoint than they are from being an associate. So there's a motivational factor for them to do it as well. But those young doctors are no different than the group that is currently transitioning out, that they want to be able to practice the way they feel is the right way to practice. And in that private environment, they get the opportunity to be able to do that. So I think that there's a time and a place for both. There's value in both. The big thing for me is to truly understand what is the seller's motivation, what are their goals, and then be able to help guide them and say, this route, or maybe a combination of the two is the way to take a look and move forward with their transition.